Hey pushers, it's Mr. Narimatsu here. Continuing with our voyage on period 8. Apologize here for the date. Let me go ahead and change that. Um, so this is going to be the Civil Rights Movement Part 1. Period 8 is a little bit, it reminds me, I was a former AP European history teacher, so I taught AP Euro, and it kind of reminds me a lot of AP Euro, and the fact that there's so much going on in so many different places, foreign policy within our own country, there's economic issues. And also, I think also because it's such a recent history, we have more documentation about it, a lot more film, a lot more radio, a lot more press, and that kind of deepens our understanding, I would say, of kind of what was happening historically. So because of that, it's a lot of information. So you'll notice that last week we really tried to focus on the Cold War. Really from all the way from Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Harry Truman and the idea of containment all the way to the end of the Vietnam War, right? And actually, theoretically, the end of the Cold War comes into period 9. But here you're going to get a little bit of that here and there, especially towards the end of this week or at the end of at the end of this period, in which we kind of look at Nixon and Carter and what they're doing with communism at that time. So that's what we kind of did last week. This week, we're going to be focusing on, and for the next few activities, we're going to be focusing on the civil rights. So it's almost like, again, we're going to have to rewind back historically all the way. I'm going to actually go back to the Civil War to remind you of some things in the Civil War and going through the Brown versus Board of Education, going into Rosa Parks and the emergence of Martin Luther King and the march and the ultimate passage under Lyndon B. Johnson of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So that's where we're going to kind of take you. So again, just a mental part. This is what I felt like. That's why I said AP European history. And AP European history, it seems like you like study on a country like in England and what's happening at all levels, and then you kind of go to France and kind of go, and that's why I feel like we're doing our country, but we're doing it kind of more like themes. So again, our last few ones we're kind of focused on the Cold War and the idea of the Cold War. This one's kind of going back and focus on us domestically with a really focused attention towards civil rights and the specifically African American civil rights. Now, later, this will branch from African American civil rights to other groups. We're going to talk deeply about the Native American experience, women and feminism, and also the LGBT community as it was identified in the article. We definitely identify as LGBTQ plus community. So, anyways, let's go ahead and get back now into the civil rights and talk about that. So these are the activities you're going to be doing today. The Brown versus Board of Education. I learned about the horrific murder of Emmett Till and also the Montgomery bus boycott with a famous lady known as Rosa Parks, which I'm sure you guys are really familiar with a lot of these names. And if not, that's all right. That's my job. So let's get into it. All right, guys. So one thing I want to remind you guys about is the Civil War amendments, right? The 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. It's nice and beautiful right here, but actually I like this because it's really easy. Outlawing slavery, reverses the Dred Scott, saying that if you are born here, you're a citizen, and citizenship cannot be denied based on color, so you're given equal rights under the Constitution, and that the 15th Amendment is kind of towards voting. Now, we'll remind ourselves that these were passed in the South, but remember the South had a series of what we call Jim Crow laws, and they were basically segregationist policies and even ways to actually eliminate the political participation of African Americans. For an example, they would create something called a poll tax. Whenever you go to vote, that's actually called a poll. So you'd have to pay a fee to actually vote. And obviously, there was a lot of the majority of the African American population, especially right out of the Civil War, found themselves in poverty. So this effectively eliminated their right to vote and participate in local and national politics. So remember that at the end of the Civil War, the goal of the North is to kind of get the psychology of the South to change, to deny the idea of slavery, to engage a more kind of equal view of humanity, right? And that's kind of what the goal of the abolitionists and this religious fervor that they had in the North. But the South, as we know, never really, really accepts that view of the world, right? Not all of them practice loyalty back to the United States and the Constitution. We literally have to the North has to literally bring their federal troops into state constitutions and enforce some of these 13th, 14th, 15th amendments. And a lot of the state constitutions simply deny even trying to pass them, so, to say that the South like accepted guilt for the institution of slavery, that they were now no longer going to be racist, and that they, definitely accepted defeat during the Civil War is completely wrong, right? They're continually fighting, and I would say continually fighting today. So with that being said, let's just appreciate that part of our history, because we have to understand that before we start talking about these major civil rights movements. Another thing that happened, remember, in the Supreme Court was a court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. I don't know if I have any pictures in here. It's not really good anyways. But Plessy versus Ferguson, this is now in 1896. So Civil War ends about 1865. You get the passage of those amendments in that year and a few years after. Later in 1896, we kind of come up to this idea of this segregated facilities, right? Colored bathrooms, white bathrooms, colored drinking fountains, white, sections in the bus that Rosa Parks will challenge. A lot of the South and society had segregated their society, right? And the idea that this could be okay under Plessy versus Ferguson was confirmed by the Supreme Court. They said something called separate but equal. You can have separate facilities, they just have to be equal. And in practice, they weren't equal, and this is going to come very true in the Brown versus Board of Education. So remind yourself that these amendments are in there and they're somewhat being agreed to, but they're very much being denied. And now we have a Supreme Court case that is kind of enforcing the idea of what we call segregation, right? Racial segregation. So definitely not the full equality that was trying to be guaranteed under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So out of the separate but equal, kind of clause comes this massive issue about from Brown versus the Board of Education. And what this was it, first of all, it exposed, number one, some of the inherent equalities of the separate but equal clause under the Plessy versus Ferguson case. The black schools compared to white schools were definitely more underfunded. They received less supplies. Their teachers received less support. There are always, I remember hearing history stories. You'll have to back these up because this is just in my teaching and my learning of history, but stories of third or fourth used books, many of them missing papers, not even the correct facilities for like desks and chairs. So the separate but equal was more separate, but not inherently equal. The Brown versus Board of Education actually is not really about those facilities. It's about a young child trying to go to a school that's much closer, that happens to be a white school. And through that experience, they start moving towards this idea of desegregation. One of the most famous individuals in there is a lawyer named Thurgood Marshall. And Thurgood Marshall, as you can see right here, will become a Supreme Court justice later. So just to let you know, at this time he was an attorney for the Brown versus Board of Education, but after that he will actually join the ranks of becoming a Supreme Court justice. And that's what's kind of cool about this part. You're going to start seeing some of the individuals that are involved in the Black Lives Matter most recently. Like John Lewis, he was in the Washington Bridge. So a lot of this history that we're learning now, we are kind of fortunate to see that these people are still present in our history today, or have been just recently present. Unfortunately, John Lewis just passed within the last year, and I'm recording this in 2021. So that kind of upsets the idea of upsets the idea of separate but equal, and it's another step towards civil rights, towards moving towards this integration rather than this segregation, right? And this is actually a momentous case that actually overturns it, right, and says no, it's inherently not separate but equal. Another event that happens during these early years of the civil rights movement is the death of a young man, or young boy, actually. I think he's 14 years old, called Emmett Till. And just as the story goes, he was a guy from Chicago, a kid from Chicago that came down to, I believe it was Mississippi. And because he, being a child of the North, I guess he didn't really understand the kind of racially segregated kind of culture that is in the South, and more importantly, the feeling of white superiority, right? As a black individual, you will never look up to or kind of question a white male or a white person at all. So he's kind of going in here a little naive, a little childish, and he is a child, right? He's 14 years old. And as the story goes, he makes some kind of like cat call whistle, that we would call, I don't know, I call it cat call whistle, to a much older female, white female, and that's her. And she accounts that he actually grabbed her. So he grabbed her, and later on, she will admit that this to be completely false. But two of her family members who she confesses this kind of lie to get riled up and pissed off and basically come in and find him and kill him in a very, very violent way. And it'll describe in the Khan Academy, and I apologize that it's so grotesque. But the reason why they what's interesting about this death is, these type of deaths happen all the time, but the mother had decided to have an open casket despite the kind of mutilation of this young child. And it just thrust us into the American public, right? The American public is going to see this. It's going to get national news. There's multiple people that see this themselves, and it horrifies them. This type of degree of hatred and racism can exist. So again, we're getting more and more putting the face of segregation and racism straight into the face of the American public. And the more they see it, the more they become outraged. Out of this kind of history, out of Emmett Till actually comes Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks will say she was inspired on her day not to move to the back of the bus by the death of Emmett Till. And she was just so horrified that she felt that she needed to be participating in this movement. And we can see these things, right? These movements happen very quickly, correct? Like, the Black Lives Matter thing, it just happens, right? These things go. And so she kind of felt that she had this role to help further this as well. And I don't think she necessarily, I think she was making an individual action at individual time that just happened to become historic within the moment. I think that's what we all do. I don't think she was necessarily trying to find this obviously for glory or fame, but just making an individual decision at individual time, which is interesting. But as you know, for you don't know, Rosa Parks was in the South. I want to say it was in Atlanta for some reason, but I may be wrong. But she kind of refused. There was a part of the bus, the public bus, where there's a colored section. I mean, there's two kind of sections. There's a colored section in the back if you're a person of color, and theoretically the front should be, you can sit wherever you want, but as white individuals would fill the front, you were to go to the back. And so the front was starting to get a little bit fuller. Rosa Parks was in the front, and the bus conductor asked her to move, and she simply does not, and she is fined and jailed. And out of these conversations will come Martin Luther King, and he'll thrust into this, right? So it's just interesting, right? These kind of sequence events, these, if we were talking about communism, we talk about the domino theory, right? These dominoes just line up, and one hits into another and hits into another. Although that found to be not true in the idea of especially Vietnam, which we'll talk about later. So I don't mean to confuse you too much, but I guess as a historian who appreciate the idea of this thing called these domino events, right? That just knock into another and thrust one person to another person into another person into a course of action, right? What we call cause and effect. So anyways, so that's the early parts of civil rights. We're going to be getting deep into this. This is a huge chunk of period 8. I would say the two most important ideas of period 8 would be the Cold War and our foreign policy and our idea of world power, and also domestically civil rights, and how civil rights branches into, again, feminism, gay rights, and Native American rights, and multiple other things, from environmentalism to a lot of the different causes that we see today. So won't get into that right now. We'll save that for our next one as we go further into our voyage about the focus towards civil rights and treating people of color, especially African Americans, as equal as we can. All right, guys. We'll see you in the next one. Take care.